Hello and welcome to part 4 of Williams-Mullen's series on mezzanine lending. And today we are going to be looking at the types of problems that arise with respect to mezz loans for borrowers. In part 2, we saw that those loans provide additional flexibility for the borrowers and are a great additional tool in their toolkit. But today we'll be looking at some of the things that make mezzanine loans problematic and a real issue for those borrowers. So I'm going to start with Randal addressing some of those issues.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So one downside to borrowers is that adding a mezzanine loan requires a more complex organizational structure in order to accommodate the two levels of loans. So the borrower is going to need to form multiple single-purpose entities and set those up so that the mezzanine borrower is the sole owner of the senior borrower, and the senior borrower is the sole owner of the underlying real property. And putting this new structure into place will likely require new operating agreements, amendments to existing operating agreements, and potentially assignments of membership interests among various entities in the borrower's existing organizational structure. And the reason for that is the borrower and the senior borrower have to be separate entities in order to protect, the two lenders' respective collateral and for other bankruptcy protection purposes, which we're not going to get into in this. That adds, cost and expense and complexity to adding a mezzanine loan. And another downside is that, adding a mezz loan to the capital stack increases upfront costs. You have to negotiate two sets of loan documents, which are typically similar but not quite identical. So that adds complexity and expense to negotiations. And adding a mezzanine loan may also require that certain specialist opinions, such as bankruptcy non-consolidation opinions, be delivered. And that's particularly the case if the underlying mortgage loan is a CMBS loan, and those opinions alone can be upwards of $25,000. And then from a practical standpoint, adding a mezzanine loan just adds to the complexity of operating the property. Having two loans means that major decisions require the consent of both lenders. For example, you'll need both senior lender and mezzanine lender consent to entering into new leases for the property, granting an easement, improving the property, or even developing a new operating budget for the property. In that same vein, two loans also means twice the reporting obligations. For example, financial reports with respect to the property will need to be delivered to both lenders, and both lenders will typically require a right to inspect the property, and the borrower is responsible for those costs to both lenders.
That's right. And the language in the two loan agreements, one of the benefits for borrowers is, as we said in an earlier part of this series, the loan agreements are really carved off the same initial loan document. But the reaction you get from the two lenders to those issues may not be identical. You may have an exceedingly good relationship with a senior lender, for example, who is willing to cut the borrower a break and give some accommodation with respect to a certain issue. But the mezzanine lender may not share that same attitude. Again, in one of the prior episodes, we talked about opportunistic lenders who make mezzanine loans with the eye to perhaps acquiring the asset at the end of the day. Those types of lenders, if a default scenario exists, may not be willing to give you the same type of accommodation as a senior lender would. And therefore, you should really be aware of that at the beginning of the loan, because the threat of foreclosure is always out there. The other thing about having two loan agreements is you've essentially got twice as many ways to default. Each lender can decide independently whether an event of default has occurred. They don't have to act in unison. They don't have to consult each other. And in fact, what lenders will tell you is they have no obligation to look out for that other lender. So essentially, when something happens that relates to the property or the borrowing entities, each lender can make an independent decision as to whether there's an event of default and the action that they are going to take as a result of that. There may be events of default in each loan agreement which are actually different from each other. Very often, mezz lenders may have conditions that would cause defaults under their agreement which are not identical to the senior agreement. And for example, in mezz loan agreements, they may cross-reference any default under the senior loan, for example. A senior lender may have a default and waive that, but that doesn't waive the ability of a mezz lender to say, under the terms of that senior loan, default has occurred. So again, the number of ways that default scenarios can occur for lenders is extremely high. In a default scenario, as I said, the lenders may not have an identity of interest, and that really is quite a costly thing for borrowers. Is if you make one lender happy, it doesn't mean that the other lender needs to go along with them. If one lender decides, I am simply not going to accept a solution that the borrower has offered, you may end up dragging both loans or keeping both loans in default because you can't get one lender happy with a solution that you have come up with. So it really does cause quite a lot of stress on borrowers. And that's really important because the foreclosure of the membership interest not only will cut off the equity. Mezzanine lenders have the ability to go out and sell those membership interests. And for borrowers, that is a real issue because the timeline within which a lender can take those membership interests and sell them is usually a lot shorter than can be engineered with a sale of real estate. Where a sale of real estate or a judicial foreclosure has to be pursued to cut off certain interests in the property, that can take a number of weeks. If you look at most mezzanine loan agreements and the pledges that go with them, those pledge agreements very often talk about borrowers agreeing that if they get 10 days notice of a sale of those membership interests, they agree that that will be more than adequate to protect their interests. And having 10 days to come up with enough money or some other methodology to cure your default really can be quite problematic. The other thing that is a problem for mezz borrowers as well is, as we said earlier, there are usually non-recourse guarantees that are attached to these loans. Those non-recourse guarantees stop borrowers interfering in the exercise of remedies. So again, a potential sale of your membership interest in your senior borrower, that guarantee prevents a guarantor or anybody else usually affiliated with that guarantor from stepping in and trying to object to that type of sale or taking other action that might delay or prevent it. And so that becomes a pretty big issue both for the mezz borrower and for its principal investors. That's all we had on part 4. In part 5, we'll be looking at what the issues are that come up that are problematic for mezzanine lenders, and we hope you'll be able to join us for that. Thank you.